Hello, greetings. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Mroz-Sailer, and I'm the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Clerk Brenzil will be speaking about invasive weeds in Native Prairie. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Before we begin, I'd like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with Native Prairie conservation or species at risk. On September 29th, Hannah Wilson, a Master's of Science candidate at the University of Regina, will be speaking about bats. You can register for this webinar on the PCAP website, and all past webinars have been recorded and can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel. This webinar will be uploaded there in the near future. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. And if you're on the cell phone app, you can send your question by chat to the organizer, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, Eco-Friendly West, Enbridge, Information Services Corporation, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, SaskTel, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. In-kind support has been provided by the Government of Saskatchewan. And I'd like to pass it over to Kylie Graham with Wildlife Habitat Canada to bring greetings and introduce today's speaker.
Hi everyone, my name is Kylie Graham. I am the Grant Administrator at Wildlife Habitat Canada for the Habitat Conservation Stamp Initiative, as well as the Community Conservation Action Plan. Wildlife Habitat Canada is an environmental non-for-profit organization that works to provide financial support to conservation projects across the country. We are pleased to have supported SKPCAP in their Native Prairie Speaker Series and Prairie's Got the Goods Week over the past 4 years. SKPCAP does amazing work in connecting the public to the environment around them by providing valuable information about vital prairie ecosystems and the species at risk. Their conservation efforts continuously increase awareness and understanding of Native Prairie and the species within. As Caitlin mentioned, today's speaker is Clerk Brenzil. Mr. Brenzil is the Provincial Specialist Weed Control with Saskatchewan Agriculture in Regina. He has held this position since 1998. He provides information and recommendations on weed control to producers, agronomists, government departments and agencies, as well as municipalities. Mr. Brenzil has experience in weed management with the crop protection industry, university research, and government. So without further ado, here he is.
Okay, there we go. Oh, I think it's afternoon. Good afternoon. We'll be talking about invasive weeds in rangeland here today. And just to kind of kick it off, we'll talk a little bit about what the impact of invasive weeds are in habitat generally, and essentially the United Nations has determined that invasive species are second only to the two-legged invasive species, and that'd be us, as far as a cause of direct habitat destruction. And the only thing that tops that is development activities, so essentially building things on top of habitat. What makes a plant invasive? Well, it's exotic, so it doesn't come from here. It comes from somewhere else, whether that be Europe or Asia. The Middle East is another common place for invasive plants to come from. They're obviously invasive, so they spread easily by roots or seeds, and they're destructive, and they cause serious harm and economic loss. They're typically a concern for agriculture, forestry, and other natural resource-based industries. They can be problems for human health, also for infrastructure, in that they would attack things like roadways and buildings and cause damage there. They're definitely a problem for the environment, and they can be a problem for the economy. This is what we would call a typical invasion curve, which essentially plots the amount of area occupied by a particular invasive over time, and time is on the x-axis there. And essentially, when we look at management of invasive species or the damage that they can cause, we look at that curve and we can kind of put quantifying numbers to what the return on investment of control is. And so essentially prevention is the best return on dollars spent. Next would be eradication as soon as that species arrives in a landscape. Then containment to try and prevent it from spreading outside of an established area in a landscape. And then once it's escaped and widespread, we're into essentially asset-based protection, or in other words, we're into coping. And that's where we have our lowest return on dollars spent for control. We do regulate invasive plants in the province, and that's very similar to our neighbors on either side in Alberta and Manitoba. And they have very similar priorities to the way that we regulate weeds. They're provincial, all of them are provincial laws, and they all place responsibility for weed control on the landowner. They're all enabling legislation, so essentially the provinces themselves don't enforce that piece of legislation. And what they do is they delegate that enforcement authority to a local authority, whether that be a municipality in the case of Saskatchewan, or whether it be to districts in the case of Alberta and Manitoba. And what we've done with the Weed Control Act, it's a relatively new piece of legislation. What we've done is we've made it so that it establishes regulatory priorities for each of these weeds within the province, and it goes clear direction on the intensity of enforcement for the weeds based on the size of the infestation. We've regulated weeds in Saskatchewan for a long time, so it starts back with the Noxious Weeds Ordinance, which we have records back to 1883 on. Then the Noxious Weed Act was passed in 1909, shortly after the province became incorporated. And the most recent version of that piece of legislation is 1984. And then in 2010, we brought the Weed Control Act into force, which replaced the Noxious Weed Act, and set it up a little bit differently. So essentially now the Weed Control Act consists of three parts. We've got the act itself, which essentially provides the body of responsibility for landowners, for municipalities, what their authorities and responsibilities are, and the standards of control. We also have the weed control regulations. They provide additional definitions not included in the act, and they also provide copies of forms that are given official designation under the legislation. And thirdly, we have the minister's order designating prohibited noxious nuisance weeds, and that's essentially just the weed list. So the weed list has a set of three different levels in it. The prohibited, noxious, and nuisance weeds. And so the highest priority weeds in that list are the prohibited weeds. These are typically absent or rare and a threatening plant with demonstrated aggressiveness in other jurisdictions. And we've got a list here that gives you an idea of the things that we have on that list. There are only a handful of weeds on this list that are actually in the province to date, and many of them haven't been recorded in the province to date. And so the enforcement goal with these things is essentially eradication. And eradication is a term that tends to get tossed around a little more willy-nilly than its true definition would suggest. Everybody talks about eradicating a weed when they're really talking about controlling. When we're talking about eradicating a weed, we're talking about making sure that that weed does not grow in any way or any form for a period of time that it would take to be sure that that weed is gone from the landscape, and that would be true eradication. And so municipalities have the power to declare a prohibited area by bylaw, and that can essentially applies to the area that has the weed, and it can last for 5 years from the last occurrence of the weed at that site. So if you have that weed pop up in year 4 of that bylaw area, then that clock resets for another 5 years. And that gives them various authorities, and they need to inform my boss, essentially. The weed inspector during that time needs to monitor the site to make sure that that weed is not emerging, and if they do find any plants, they need to treat them right away with the most effective measure for control in order to eradicate the plant. Again, we're doing this hopefully on a very small scale, and so the impact on the environment would be minimized in that case, whichever method that we're utilizing in that area. We want to post the area so that we can limit traffic through that area to spread the weed, and we could even erect a barrier around that area. And we can also prohibit the seeding of crops, entry of people or machines or domestic animals into that prohibited area as well. Or the weed inspector can issue the order for destruction of the crop. The other category that we have is noxious weeds. And noxious weeds are established in the province in beyond a practical eradication in some part of the province, but there's still areas of the province where it's free from that particular species. So the enforcement goal is just to prevent the spread of those noxious weeds. And you can see there's a pretty substantial list of weeds that are deemed noxious in the province. The ones with the asterisks, those are all ones that have been former ornamental plants or could be linked to some medicinal use of some kind and may have been imported intentionally into the province and for those reasons. In the case of noxious weeds, weed inspector can make orders and agreements if it's less than 5 hectares per quarter section, and a quarter section is 160 acres or 60 hectares. So if it's less than 5 hectares on that quarter section, they can order destruction of a crop in order to manage that. If it's greater than 5 hectares, they're into a containment strategy. So essentially you put a no man's land buffer around that area that you essentially execute an eradication strategy within that buffer. And then inside the buffer, you put in integrated management practices such as biocontrol. You could do specific herbicide treatments. You could do manual treatments, things like that. And then you can also issue orders to prohibit the movement of material, machines, and domestic animals as well if there's a risk of them moving some of those things around. The third category is nuisance weeds, and these things are widely established across the province, but they have some kind of characteristic that makes them move relatively easy from one parcel to the next, and these could also include native plants like foxtail barley and blue lettuce and poverty weed. And in the case of nuisance weeds, we're just basically they're only triggered on a complaint. And so essentially we're just looking at trying to mitigate the reason why these things are out of step with the areas around them. And sometimes that could be that you've got some environmental characteristic that promotes the growth of that weed. And so you want to take measures to overcome that environmental characteristic. And so if we look at where these things sit on this curve, the prohibited weeds are in the prevention and eradication area, noxious weeds are in containment, and then nuisance weeds are in that asset protection kind of thing. But today we'll just talk specifically about prohibited weeds and noxious weeds. So the prohibited weeds and I'll largely stick to plants that are in the province already, and I'll pass over a lot of the species that are not in the province yet, just because it has more relevance to folks here that are on the line. So spotted knapweed essentially is a taprooted perennial plant, and essentially it's kind of like an extended biennial in the sense that it can stay as a rosette for a few years, and then it can produce flowers for a few years, and then it dies. So it's a bit of a challenging plant. Very pretty plant. It's got very nice thistle-like flowers on it, and is quite attractive. But unfortunately, it can cause problems with competing with native areas. The black spots on the flower bud are the way it gets its name. So spotted knapweed has it gets about 1 meter tall, anywhere from a foot to 1 meter tall, and it's got deeply lobed leaves, as you can see in the bottom picture there, and compound leaves. The seed viability in the soil is fairly long. 30% of seed is still viable after 8 years in the soil. The plant expands rapidly from its initial infestation point, again, because of seed spread. And it also produces allelopathic root exudates that suppress the growth of plants around it to allow better establishment potential for the seeds that it's shedding. It's unpalatable to cattle because it's got a bit of a compound in it called niacin, and it can cause about 85% loss in productivity of pastures or native areas and wildlife habitat. Currently, we've got populations in the Chaplin area. We've got 2 populations in Regina, particularly the north end of Regina, off of Turvey Road. We've also got populations at Rockglen, right at the US-Canada border, just north of the border. And there's also scattered populations in the southwest part of the province. Probably no more than about anywhere from 6 to 10 infestations in total. Diffuse knapweed is very closely related to spotted knapweed, and they're so close that they will hybridize in some cases. It's a biennial, but it can be an annual or short-lived perennial. It has a very deep taproot. Leaves are similar to spotted knapweed, only finer lobes on the leaves. Typically has white flowers, but it can have purple, particularly the hybrids that I talked about before. Can be pink and can also have some of the dark spots on them as well. Typically with diffuse knapweed, it has spines on the bracts or bud leaves, bud scales, and they're tipped with a spine that's about 1/4 of an inch long. And then it also has some lateral spines that come out from that primary spine. And again, the impacts are very similar to spotted knapweed. Again, we have scattered populations in the Maple Creek area. And we also have another population that was discovered recently in the Viscount area. Yellow star thistle, this is a plant that isn't in the province yet that we know of. There are historic records that go back in time that suggest that there was a record of this plant being in either southwestern Saskatchewan or southern Alberta. So it's something that was worth including here just for people to keep their eye out for. It's a winter annual with the deep taproot, so it does very well in dry conditions. It has a stem that's 1 to 2 meters tall. Rosettes are deeply lobed and look very similar to dandelion in some respects, but have hairs on them. The stem leaves are fused to the stem, and it creates a bit that waffle in the top left picture there that shows up on the stem. And the entire plant is covered in a fine cottony hair, and that gives it a bit of a grayish green color. The real dangerous part of this is the flowers with the spines on the bracts. A little bit bigger spines than what we see on diffuse snapweed, and these can get anywhere from 1 inch to 1.5 inches long on this bud. It also has a pair of lateral spines that come off at the base of that larger spine. And one of these plants can produce up to 100,000 seeds. And there's a couple of different types of seeds. There's one type of seed that can germinate immediately and continue the population right away. And then there's other types of seeds within the same flower that can lay dormant for up to 10 years in the soil. And so this can be problematic because of those spines on the flowers. It likes lighter soils that are well drained, and it creates these dense stands that make it difficult for wildlife or cattle to get their faces into to be able to graze in that area. It also, so they avoid the area, and it causes injury. It can also be a problem for annual crops, and it also causes a condition called repin, or contains a chemical called repin that causes a neurological condition called chewing disease in horses. So it can be toxic in some situations. As far as where this is located right now, it's in pretty much every U.S. state other than some of the Gulf states and the northeastern states. If we look at our two closest neighbors, so Montana and North Dakota, it's on the east side of North Dakota, so that one we don't have to worry too much about, and it's on the west side of Montana, so that kind of keeps us keeps a little bit of a buffer between us and the current infestations of yellow star thistle. Salt cedar is a woody invasive plant. It was initially introduced to North America as a salt-tolerant ornamental tree that would be food source for bees and for birds in the area, in the desert areas of Arizona, but it's escaped those areas since then and has moved further north as time has gone on. It's a deciduous shrub that drops its leaves every fall, and so you can see the fall coloration down there in the bottom picture. The bark is reddish brown to dark brown, and some kinds can be purple. It has small scaly leaves that turn orange in the fall, and those small scaly leaves very closely resemble the leaves that you find on a cedar plant, and hence the name. It has a very nice flower display, white to pink flowers, 4 to 5 petals. It can produce large numbers of small seeds, and so as a result can reproduce from those seeds, or it can also reproduce from buried stems that shoot out laterally from the base of the plant and then reroot in areas away from that original plant. It's very tolerant of saline soils, and in some ways it can actually create its own salinity environment, in the sense that it draws up salts into the plant, and then as those leaves drop in the fall, they land around the parent plant, and they create a higher saline environment around the base of that plant. And what that does is that displaces native vegetation that would compete with that, the seedlings of this plant. And it tends to like to establish along riparian areas and displace riparian plants. Right now we've got a couple of recorded populations. We've had one in the gravel pit used by highways in Findlater. And I think we've got a handle on that because we did that eradication measure that I talked about earlier, and so it was looked for every single year, and they found plants prior to them going to flower They were young saplings, and so they found those, took them out, and kept going back again for several years, and they haven't found any for the last 3 or 4 years. There's also a population that's just south of Swift Current, also in a gravel pit. And so we're kind of seeing a trend here that the cause of movement in this case can be excavation equipment. There's another population that's a domestic planting in Regina, and it's 2 to 4 plants in an urban lot. And so that one has yet to be managed by the city of Regina. So it's something that gives me a bit of consternation every once in a while. Common or European barberry. This plant was established here, and there was a very significant eradication effort that took place, largely because it's a secondary host for a cereal disease. And as a secondary host, what it does is it allows that disease to go through its sexual stage, whereas if it was just on the primary host, it would reproduce just through division and producing spores, not go through a sexual stage. And that sexual stage allows it to create more diversity within the disease population and develop resistance to management options that we have available for the cereal crops. It's a deciduous shrub that drops its leaves every year, gets about 10 feet tall. Bark is gray with sharp spines on it, and it usually has those 3 spines there. And if you cut the tree down and you look on the inside, the wood is yellow on the inside. Leaves are small toothed, ovate leaves, pretty nondescript leaves really. And they're borne in clusters on the branches. Flowers are yellow and they smell bad, so that's a clue that you've got something that isn't wanted as well. They hang in bunches. They're relatively small flowers, but they hang in bunches, and then the fruit are oblong berries that are deep red in color. Garlic mustard, again, one that we haven't recorded in Saskatchewan yet, but it has been recorded in the Edmonton area. And so that's kind of increases the intensity on our radar. Essentially, it's a member of the mustard family, so it's got the very typical alternate leaf, sleek type fruit on it, 4-petaled leaves or 4-petaled flowers. The flowers are white, however, so it's one of the few members of the mustard family that has white flowers. And the leaves are typically kidney shaped, especially when they're seedlings, and they eventually evolve into those triangular leaves that you see there. And those upper leaves are more coarsely lobed than the younger ones. It likes to grow in wooded areas where it's partly shady and moist, typically. So ditches and roadways and any place where you've got shelter for it. And the whole plant has a very onion or garlic-like odor to it, and it flowers anywhere from May to June. And again, reported in the Edmonton area. Perennial pepperweed, another member of the mustard family with white flowers. Perennial pepperweed looks an awful lot like horseradish plants in the sense that it's a very stout-rooted perennial, and the root is also spicy like horseradish root is. Stems can get up to 1 meter tall. Leaves are elliptical, essentially, with a little bit of serration at the edge, and they're hairless, and they have very waxy coating. The flowers, again, are 4-petaled, as other members of the mustard family are, And the seed pods are unique in the sense that they have a plenum in the middle, and the plenum runs crossway to the wide, there dissects the narrow portion of the pod, whereas with horseradish, the plenum runs the other direction. So that's a distinctive way to tell the two apart. Poison hemlock, another perennial, biennial or perennial member of the carrot family. Can grow 3 to 8 feet tall, and this plant is highly poisonous, all parts of it, and it reproduces only by seed, so it has a very thick taproot. Stems are hollow, ridged, and they have purple spots, and that seems to be a trend with some of the more toxic members of the carrot family, is that they will have purple spots on them. And the leaves are shiny, 3 to 4 times divided, and they clasp the stem where they attach. And if you crush any of the foliage, it has a fairly foul odor to it. Flowers are white, and they're shaped in an umbel, which is umbrella shaped, and that's where you get the name umbel. And they set seed with 2 seeds formed together in a pair, and oftentimes it can be mistaken for parsnip. Generally on dry to moist soils, and it can tolerate poorly drained soils as well. So it can tolerate damp areas. Hound's-tongue is a biennial tap-rooted weed that is up to 1.2 meters tall, has soft hairs on the entire plant, and the leaves can be 7 to 30 centimeters long and shaped like a dog's tongue, essentially, and hence the name. The flowers are a dull reddish purple color with 4 rounded triangular nutlet seeds that are covered with hooked prickles. And essentially one of the problems with those hooked prickles is that they get caught on animal fur and they get transferred around that way. And the seeds also contain a toxic alkaloid that makes it so that you can have livestock poisoning from this as well. It is fairly well adapted to forested areas, and so primary habitat for this would be in some of the moisture areas of the province and in some of the river valleys that run through the province. We do have this in the southeast part of the province to a fairly substantial level, and we also have just introduced a biocontrol agent that's been very successful in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains to control this as well. Puncture vine is an annual branching plant branching from the base, and it spreads prostrate along the ground. Leaves are hairy and have 4 to 8 pairs of oval leaflets on a compound leaf. The flower is yellow and they're borne in leaf axils. And the plant looks very similar to another weed that's called silverweed that's in the Potentilla family. And the fruit is the thing that's problematic about this plant, in that it's got very sharp spines on it that can puncture through shoe soles, bicycle tires, animal feet, things like that. So it can be problematic from that perspective. It has been grown in Saskatchewan as a nutraceutical plant, and that industry has given up this because they determined that it was actually invasive. And so they've tried to clean up any populations of it. Field scabious is related to blue buttons. It's a member of the teasel family, and was introduced from Europe, probably in a wildflower mix. It's a taprooted perennial and will persist for several years. And it's invasive and aggressive in undisturbed areas. It does like moist, high organic matter habitat. So if you've got boggy areas, it does like those areas, but it will grow in drier areas as well. But more than likely, it's going to get started in that boggy area and then move out of there into the upland areas. Leaves are quite distinctive. They're very deeply lobed. And they're borne opposite on the stem, and you have a large internodal area between the stem nodes. They get very much reduced near the top of the plant, and there's next to no leaves once the plant starts flowering. And the entire plant is covered in very coarse, stiff hairs. The flowers are disc type, which means that we've got several flowers that are mounted on a disc platform, very much similar to things like dandelion and things like that. They start out as a very pale pink purple color, and then they, as they expand, they turn into more of either a pale violet color or pale blue color, and then eventually it turns into a dome of coarse seeds, and those seeds will shatter very easily once the flowering is done. You can produce about 2,000 seeds per plant, and you can get a fair number of plants in a fairly small area. Right now we have a few populations reported in the province. We've had one population at Birch Hills there's been a lot of work done on, and they think that maybe they've got it pretty much under control right now. There was a report of a population in the White Beach pasture in the northeast part of the province. We had a population that was about 9 kilometers south of Yorkton that's under management right now. And then we've got a new population that was just found in the Sturgis area. Red Bartia is an annual weed that reproduces only from seed, and it germinates late in the spring. It's something referred to as a hemiparasite, and essentially what that means is that it grows independently, but then particularly in grass hay fields. And so what it does is that it attaches itself to the roots of a hay crop after it's been cut, and then uses those roots in order to fuel its own growth. And so that's what they mean by hemiparasite. So it's parasitic on the roots, but it still produces its own chlorophyll, whereas a true parasite would not even produce chlorophyll. It doesn't really persist in annual cropping because of the disturbance and the rotation into broadleaf species. It only attacks the grass species. It's invasive in hayland, pasture, and even lawns can have it invade, and livestock won't eat it. And it's in the same family as things like toadflax. And this is what it looks like in a hayfield after that field has been cut and it's taken over the roots of the grass plants that are in that field. And you can see the entire field has turned a dark purple color. Horulissum, another member of the mustard family. And even though it appears as though it has 8 petals on its flowers, it's actually deeply lobed, deeply cleft set of 4 petals. Stems are upright, and essentially it grows a rosette initially, and then from that rosette it essentially just produces stem after that with flowers and then seed pods, and that's essentially all that it produces. And that picture in the bottom there is pretty typical of what it looks like. It likes lighter soils. It also can cause lamination in horses if they consume hay with the Horulissum in it. And we also have, it's got a grayish appearance because it's got fine hairs all over it. It's found in Regina as well as along Highway 1 near White City, and probably many other areas as well. So that's all the prohibited weeds. Actually, Horulissum is actually a noxious weed, so I kind of got to jump on a noxious weed there. So noxious weeds, again, eradication if under 5 hectares, containment and integrated control if over 5 hectares per quarter section. The first plant we'll talk about is field bindweed. Essentially, it's a member of the morning glory family and has nice trumpet-shaped flowers that are bright white or pink. It has spade-shaped leaves that that are a bit different than what you would see on wild buckwheat, a common annual weed in your garden. Generally, the leaves on bindweed are longer than they are wide, whereas the wild buckwheat leaves would be similar width to what they are long. It spreads via seed and also deep creeping roots, so it can root very deeply in the soil and spread laterally through runners. The seeds can last in the soil for up to 50 years. Wild parsnip is a wild relative of the domestic parsnip plant, and it's what's referred to as a monocarpic perennial, is that it will grow as a rosette for long enough till it gets to a particular massive root, and once it hits that particular massive root, then it'll flower, and it flowers once and then it dies. It requires a cold treatment in order to flower, and it's not that different from things like carrots and parsnips in your garden. It grows from 1 to 5 feet high. Again, hollow stems and members of the carrot family, that's a common characteristic. Has a large taproot, again, parsnip. And it generally has a relatively light green color, and the flowers are yellow and borne on umbels. One of the challenges with wild parsnip is that it can cause photodermatitis, which essentially means that the compounds in the plant called photocoumarins or ferrocoumarins are oil-based. They get into the skin, they get into the dermis, and they reduce the skin's ability to defend itself against the sun. So essentially, you just get the worst sunburn you've ever had on your leg. If you get it washed off very quickly, you can reduce that the injury from that, but that sap can last in your skin for months if it gets embedded into that deep dermis layer. We do have several infestations north of Saskatoon in the Osler-Hague area. We also have infestations that are in the southeast along Highway 48, as well as to the west of North Battleford along Highway 40 and other scattered areas around the province. Oxeye daisy is the ancient relative of the Shasta daisy. It's a creeping rooted perennial daisy. Does not have a deep taproot, just has a fibrous root. And Shasta daisy can also revert back to oxeye daisy over time as well if left to produce seed. It has spatula-shaped leaves with scalloped edges on it, and the leaves are very reduced as you get to the top of the plant, and the very white, typical white petaled daisy type flowers at the top. It can taint milk, and it does have, it's common in pockets in Prince Albert and Regina and other areas throughout the province. Dame's Rocket, another introduced ornamental. Simple taprooted perennial, member of the mustard family. It's one of the only purple colored flowers in the mustard family. And it's essentially a single stem that is unbranched until you get into the flowering canopy. It has long triangular leaves with serrated edges, and they're attached directly to the stem, and sometimes they will produce lobes that go out past the stem on the opposite side. It outcompetes desirable forage in native rangeland, and it's common in ornamental plantings in some of the urban areas. This population in the bottom picture was in one of the pastures near Crake. Unfortunately, there are no herbicide options to control this, registered herbicide options to control this at this point. Purple loosestrife is essentially all the Lythrum species and typically ornamental. There were hybrids that were developed that were supposed to be non-invasive, but as it said, it was found later that when they crossed with the wild type, they did produce seed and became invasive as a result. Stems are angular. It can have 4 or more sides, so anywhere from 4 to 6 sides on it, and has winged elements running up and down the stem as well on those angles, like at the edge of the angles. The stem's hollow. Leaves are opposite on the stem, long and elliptical shaped, and they also wrap around the stem going to the other side. Flowers can be anywhere from magenta to purple, borne on a single spike and attached directly to the stem. And there are presently many small infestations in wetlands throughout Saskatchewan. Common tansy is, of course, perennial weed, largely petalless member of the daisy family. It's an introduced ornamental, potentially as a garden herb as well. Has deep green compound leaves. Plant produces a wide range of chemical compounds, some of which are poisonous to livestock and can cause abortions. It grows in thick clumps that outcompete desirable forage, and generally the boundary line that it likes to habitat is north of the rail line that runs parallel to Highway 15, and it prefers moist habitats. Leafy spurge is a persistent, deep-rooted weed with creeping roots. It can spread laterally by root up to about 4 meters per year. It has linear leaves that are pale and pale green. The plant produces white latex sap through the entire plant that can cause skin irritation. It grows in thick colonies like the one in the bottom picture that outcompete desirable forage. It has adaptive leaves around its flower parts to attract insects, and that's what the yellow element is there, is just adapted leaves, kind of like your poinsettias at Christmas. And it has 3-chambered seed pod, and it spits seeds up to 20 feet from the parent plant. And scentless cameo can be an annual, winter annual, biennial, or short-lived perennial. It has leaves that are several times divided and very lacy. This is really going to drive me crazy. The flowers are daisy-like and initiated on long photo periods. So during the long summer days, it's initiated. Plants that emerge late in the season form rosettes and overwinter to the following year when they produce more blooms. And a single large plant or 1 square meter of a solid infestation can produce 300,000 to 1 million seeds. So it can be quite prolific, and you can see how it's invading that winter wheat crop there on the right-hand side and how invasive it can be. Generally, it only takes advantage of disturbances in perennial cover, but once it does get established, it can persist for a fair amount of time. So those are some of the weeds that are currently on the weed list, and we are reviewing that weed list and looking at several others that we may want to add down the road. One is Himalayan balsam. It's an annual plant that can grow up to 4 centimeters a day and can achieve heights of up to 3 meters high. It again has explosive seed pods and can propel its seeds up to 7 meters from the parent. It can reroot from adventitious roots that come off the nodes. So if you cut the plant down and you lay it on the ground, it can reroot and keep on going. And it outcompetes neighboring vegetation. And we have a significant infestation in the Prince Albert, city of Prince Albert. Orange hawkweed or meadow hawkweed are essentially perennials that produce rosettes and then send up a flowering stalk. The entire plant is covered in dense hair. The leaves are spatula shaped, and the aerial flower stalks produce 3 or 4 ray type flowers. And in the orange hawkweed, they're bright orange with yellow centers, and the yellow hawkweed obviously are yellow. They reproduce via creeping lateral roots or stolons. or by windborne seeds. They do tolerate a shady environment, so it might be more of a problem for the parkland area of the province. They also displace desirable vegetation, and we do have reports of the orange hawkweed in Moose Jaw and Regina, and the meadow hawkweed has been found in one of the pastures in the north as well. Ventinata, or North Africa grass, is a winter annual grass that invades rangeland, hay, and roadsides. It has very similar characteristics to downy brome. It's currently reported in Montana and southern Alberta. It is kind of a hybrid between, or looks like a hybrid between downy brome and wild oat, with the long awn that can twist when it dries up and gets wet. So, and the invasive pigweeds that are all the rage in the US are right on our doorstep, and so those are ones that we also want to add to our list. Water hemp and palmer amaranth. Water hemp has longer, narrower leaves than typical pigweed does. Both are hairless. And palmer amaranth, the petiole of the leaf is longer than the body of the leaf. Both carry high levels of herbicide resistance and multiple resistance in single plants. So it's something that we want to keep an eye on and make sure that we prevent it from coming into the province. New noxious plants. Viper's bug loss was on the Noxious Weed Act, and I foolishly removed it. And we can find it in the southeast part of the province. It's a perennial and winter annual, can be invasive, draws bees from desirable nectar plants, and it can transfer a toxin that's found in the plant into the nectar that then goes into honey, and the plant can be toxic to livestock as well. It was also introduced as an ornamental, and we find scattered populations in southeast Saskatchewan. Common mullein is taprooted perennial, gets up to a couple meters tall in some cases if conditions are right. It's typically more invasive during wet cycles in the province and retracts during dry cycles. It can be problematic in sparsely vegetated areas where it can tend to dominate the area. It's found sporadically throughout Saskatchewan, particularly after a wet cycle. This plant often jokingly gets referred to as nature's toilet paper because it's got a nice soft fuzzy leaf to it. And there's one other thing that we would consider when we're looking at changes to this, the weed list would be to move, because houndsdung is so such a high population now in southeast Saskatchewan, we would want to move that down to Noxious. And then we have other plants like Canada thistle, nodding thistle, and kochia that are fairly ubiquitous throughout the province. And so now they probably fit better into that nuisance category now, where they're problematic still, but they're the preventing spread component of the noxious category has been overcome. And there may be other suggestions such as the sow thistles or cleavers, etc. So, and that's what I had to deliver today. Just I don't know if we're taking questions but my contact information is there if anybody wants to get to me afterwards as well.
First of all, thank you very much for the great presentation. It was really, really in depth, and it's amazing how detrimental invasive weeds are. And yeah, you did a really good job of telling us how to identify them, which is a big part of it. We do have a couple questions already, if that's okay.
Sure.
I will just pull them up here. The first one is from a listener named John. Is downy brome a growing issue in southern Saskatchewan?
I don't know that it's growing, but I think it's persistent. It's well adapted to the brown and dark brown soil zone, but it really doesn't spread much out beyond that. So it seems to be adapted to that habitat. It has a cousin called Japanese brome that will spread from the brown soils all the way through the black soil zone as well. Downy brome's more, it's one of those plants that should be easy to manage, but it tends not to be because it's got a short seed life in the soil. You should be able to put fairly intensive work to it and get rid of it in a system, but unfortunately nobody has that much patience to be able to tackle that for more than about 3 years to get in order to accomplish that. So that is what makes it a challenge. We have more herbicide options to manage it though now than we used to, and there are prospects for additional herbicides that could control it in rangeland as well.
Okay. And Suzanne is wondering how to tell the difference between oxeye and Shasta daisies. Do you have any comments about that?
Shasta daisies will be much taller, so they'll be in that 2 to 3 foot range, whereas oxeye daisy typically doesn't get much taller than about 2 feet. The petals are much longer on Shasta daisy. Shasta daisy is overall more robust plant, and everything is bigger on it, essentially.
Okay.
So that's the real
Perfect.
key.
Thanks for that answer. Is toadflax listed as a noxious weed?
There's 2 different kinds of toadflaxes. One is listed as a prohibited weed, and that's Dalmatian toadflax. And then the other is yellow toadflax, and that is listed as a noxious weed. So the difference between those two, there's a couple of key identifying features that will distinguish those two. Both have snapdragon-like flowers to them with spurs at the bottom. The Dalmatian toadflax has a heart-shaped leaf, a broad heart-shaped leaf that wraps around the stem. The yellow toadflax has a linear leaf that just attaches directly to the stem and doesn't wrap around. And then the flowers, yellow toadflax has a bright yellow flower with a, no, or is that the other way around? A pale yellow flower with a bright yellow throat. And Dalmatian toadflax has a bright yellow flower with a more of an orangey throat to it.
Okay. Great, perfect. Is wild parsnip edible?
The root should be edible, but you just have to be really careful. You can get the same fluorocoumarins from domestic parsnip if you allow it to get into that second year. So people need to be concerned about the domestic parsnip causing that sun sensitivity as well. But yeah, you should be able to eat the root of wild parsnip.
Okay. And what biocontrol agent do you use for hound's tongue?
There is a weevil that was introduced to the country. Essentially with biocontrol, we go to the original range of the weed, and we look for insects that eat just that weed. And so there are a whole series of insects that are referred to as monophagous, and so they're very closely linked to that plant for a food source, and they don't go off of that plant. So if the plant disappears, then they die. And so those are the kinds of insects that we introduce as biocontrol agents in order to eat the weeds. And so the one that's introduced on hound's tongue, I think it's Mongolus crucifer. I think I probably butchered that, but
that's okay. Thank you.
use Dr. Google.
Yes, that's right. When in doubt, Dr. Google.
Yeah.
Does Sask Ag provide education programs that advise landowners about management practices that would damage soil and encourage the growth of nuisance or invasive species? Do you know anything about that?
We have a whole group within our regional services branch that are in our regional offices that do perform a function similar to that. There are rangeland specialists and also our agro-environmental specialists. And typically what they do is they would provide information to producers on how to properly manage their native rangeland or domestic pastures.
Okay, perfect. We do like a hashtag invasive weeds social media campaign throughout the summer months to raise awareness about it. And I have a lot of people write in that say, oh, I reported this to my RM, but nothing got done. What happens if somebody reports something? Should they be putting into IMAP invasives or contacting like the Agricultural Knowledge Center? What's the best place for people to report it? And then what happens after that?
Right. The municipalities are the ones that are responsible for enforcing the Weed Control Act, but not every municipality has a weed inspector. And so that's kind of the choice of the RM. And that decision is more of a social political decision. If we have
Okay.
a prohibited weed, then we will hopefully take some measures to try and address that weed in areas that don't have a weed inspector. And what we will do is assist any RMs that do have a weed inspector in trying to manage those weeds as well. But in those RMs that don't have weed inspectors, there is a provision in the Weed Control Act that allows a petition to be circulated. And if you get more than 10 names on a petition and submit that to your RM, then they're obliged to appoint a weed inspector. So, so the will of the people does kind of have some weight at the end of the day.
Okay.
We unfortunately don't follow up on RMs as to whether they're taking action on that. But if you want to contact me and just let me know that you've given RM information and you haven't got any response, then I can have a chat with the RM and just ask them what's going on. There is funding available for several of those weeds through Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipality for herbicides, like a rebate on herbicide cost to control those weeds. For
Okay.
prohibited weeds, we also have a 50% rebate on the application costs as well. So
Okay.
again, should be on a small area, and in that case, the application costs are probably going to be more significant than the cost of the herbicide. So that's why we included that as well for the prohibited weeds.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. I've been taking questions here. I didn't know about the petition, so that's awesome. I can,
Yep.
when people type in, I can let them know about that. So thank
Yep.
you. I realize we're at 1 o'clock, but we still have a few more questions. Would it be
Sure.
okay if we go for another 5 minutes? Okay,
Yep.
perfect. Have you ever looked into the use of cover crops to prevent or fight the spread of noxious and prohibited weeds?
Unfortunately, establishing a cover crop is going to destroy the integrity of native rangeland. So that's part of the problem with that. And in some cases, some of those cover crops are the invasive species themselves. So that's the other challenge with cover crops. It's always a good management practice to establish good cover on land to make sure that you're not leaving land bare in order to provide an opportunity for invasive things to get established. But there are a lot of these invasive plants that we talked about today really don't care what kind of cover is on the land. They'll get in there and they'll get established within that cover as well. So
Okay,
it's
perfect.
it may have application in some cases, but again, part of our goal in many of these cases is to be very aggressive about managing. And cover crops, I would look at more of an integrated management strategy for established weeds.
Okay. Can you discuss biocontrols for Canada thistle?
Canada thistle has several agents that have been investigated as biocontrols, and several that have been introduced to North America. Unfortunately, none of them has really had the impact that we had hoped on Canada thistle. And so you'll often walk around and you'll see these lumps or big growths on Canada thistle. Well, that's a biocontrol agent that we've introduced. There's also seed head insects that get into the seed head and consume the seeds, but again, not enough to stop it from becoming a problem weed. And so that's been the real
Yeah.
challenge, is that the impact of those biocontrol agents has not been what we had hoped.
Okay. Is there an app for Canada that has information on legislated invasive weeds showing the plant identification, where they've been found, where they're legislated against, and like maybe with the photo ID option? Would like iNaturalist do something like that, or do you know of any
Um,
other apps?
I don't know that there's anything that combines all of those features into a single app.
Hmm.
You've for identification, iNaturalist, PlantNet, things like that are pretty good for identifying plants. They're not flawless though. So I know I've taken pictures of plants that are kind of questionable, and it'll give you several options, and often the first choice is not the correct option. So you have to be very careful when you use those weed ID apps that you don't always necessarily take the first thing that pops up and assume that it's correct.
Okay, that is good to know.
Yeah.
Um, have you had any luck with crimping of creeping thistle, or do you know anyone that's used this approach to control its spread?
You mean Canada thistle? I presume is creeping thistle is another name for Canada thistle.
Sure, yeah.
Um, Unfortunately, because you've got so much root mass underground that with new buds ready to shoot, I don't know that crimping is necessarily a very effective management strategy. It will
Okay,
reduce the vigor to some degree, but it won't get rid of it.
okay. And for if it's for Russian thistle, oh, sorry, the person just typed in
Oh, Russian
same
thistle.
thing.
Um,
Hmm.
Russian thistle is a little bit more difficult because it's an annual plant.
Hmm.
And so by the time you get to the point of crimping it, it's already got seeds on it that will allow it to persist in the environment.
Okay. And then just regarding the apps again, is there a way to add information to these apps, like just to make it about legislated weeds? Um, yeah, just to have a
Um,
resource available for people.
yeah, there's another resource for documenting weeds in Saskatchewan called IMAP Invasives.
Okay.
Um, I I'm trying to remember if it's got stock pictures in it or not. It may, but the advantage to that one is if you're in doubt and you take a picture of the thing that you're looking at and it gets sent off, there's a coordinator there that will check the identity of that plant, and then if it's not that plant, that record will get punted from the system.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hmm. That is good to know. Okay.
And the other thing is if there's a prohibited weed that gets identified in IMAP invasive, I have a high enough level account in there that it notifies me by email.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So then you're one of the experts that reply.
Well, I'm not the one that identifies, but I just have a high level of authorization. And in some cases, municipalities also have that level of authorization for their area. And so that can be just as straightforward a way to provide the RM with information on an invasive plant as if they are subscribing to IMAP invasives, which is probably the biggest uncertainty. If they are subscribing, though, they can set up that email alert function as well.
Okay. That is good to know. And then last question, because I know we're running out of time here. Where's the best place for people to be able to get beetles for spurge?
The Saskatchewan Municipality of or Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities Plant Health Officers hold a beetle collection day each year,
Okay.
and it's usually in the second week in July. And they supply folks with nets, and hopefully people give those nets back because they're not cheap. Um, and so you go out and you sweep through the leafy spurge that's there, and you collect the insects, and you put them in little bags in your cooler, and you take them back home and you release them. Um, we're always evaluating sites as well to get new sites for collection, because there is some suggestion that you can't move the insects further than about 100 miles north of where they are in order for them to adapt properly to that new climate.
Okay.
So, but yeah, keep tabs on the SARM website, and keep tabs on Twitter, because they put all kinds of announcements on Twitter. And just I don't know if the SARM PHOs have their own Twitter handle or not, but there'll be something on there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. That is good to know. So that's all the time that we have today, but I really wanted to thank you for sharing your expertise and wealth of information with you. And we've had lots of people type in too. Thank you very much. So thank you, Clark.
Okay, very welcome.
To all of our attendees, thanks for catching in. We had like well over 100 people today. It's amazing, and it's so great that we have so many people that are interested in invasive weeds, and learning more about them is the most important thing that we can do. When you leave today's webinar, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey if you don't mind filling it out, but we really appreciate the information, and we report back to our funders, and that way we can keep our speaker series going on into the future. Today's webinar has been recorded, and it will be uploaded in the very near future to the PCAP YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/user/skpcap. And we'll also post on social media when it's up there as well. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope to see you at our next webinar about bats in September. So thank you. Have a great day.